Welcome to Scripture and Shadows, Christianity's Hidden Canon.
We're diving deep today, really exploring these foundational texts within the Christian tradition.
Right.
Texts that I think it's fair to say maybe haven't gotten the attention they deserve. Like we're uncovering a hidden canon here,
Yeah, definitely. Hidden Canon, I like that.
And we're starting right at the beginning, right where it all begins, with the book of Genesis.
Makes sense.
Yeah, we're going to see how it portrays, the divine order, how God sets things up in the world, and how that plays out in those very first interactions, God and humans, face to face, practically.
Well, you've given me quite the stack of sources here, starting with Genesis, going all the way through the historical books like Kings, Paralipomenon. We've got wisdom literature, Job, Psalms, and then Tobit, Judith, Esther.
Oh, yeah.
Even into the New Testament. It's quite the collection. But, to really get to these hidden foundations like we're talking about, we have to start at the beginning, right?
Exactly. So Genesis, how does Genesis, in light of all these other texts, how does it set up this idea of God establishing order? And, how does that play out with those early interactions between God and humanity?
I mean, that's a great place to start. And I think, when we talk about Genesis, probably one of the most, I guess you could say, well-known stories that comes to mind is Noah's Ark.
Absolutely. It's iconic, It's more than just a children's story. I mean, it's got such depth.
And it's interesting because I think a lot of us, we know the basic story. It's, it's almost like a cultural touchstone at this point. But when you actually look at the text itself, there are these striking details like the why and the how of the whole flood. So I'm curious, what jumps out at you when you look at those texts, especially in light of this theme of, God responding to widespread sin, and also the role of someone like Noah, who's considered righteous.
One of the things that really strikes me is just how seriously, how severely God views this corruption that's happening on earth. It's pervasive.
Yeah.
The text is very clear. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. This wasn't just some, minor slip up.
Yeah.
It was a fundamental deviation from this order that God had set up, right? So, and then you see the consequences of that. The decree is, I will destroy them with the earth.
Wow.
Pretty heavy stuff. It really shows the magnitude of this judgment that's coming. But then you also see this other side, right? This idea of individual righteousness, and Noah really embodies that just before me in this generation. And so he becomes this vessel, this instrument of preservation in the midst of all this destruction. And I think it's fascinating, all the detailed instructions that God gives Noah about building this ark. I mean, everything from the timber planks, the little rooms, the pitch inside and out. It's very specific. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. It really, the single window, the door on the side, 3 stories.
It's blueprint.
It's a blueprint, exactly. And it really speaks to, I think, this idea that in a corrupted world, paying attention to the divine word, to God's instructions, really matters. It's crucial.
And you can imagine, right, this vessel, you said, 300 by 50 by 30. I mean, that comes out to, around 450,000 square cubits?
Yeah, it's enormous.
That's a huge boat.
Yeah. And
it's not just Noah's family in there. It's, 2 of every living creature, male and female, to preserve life, essentially, And they had to bring provisions for food for all of them too, right?
Yeah, it's this massive undertaking. It really shows not only the scale of God's plan, this plan for renewal, but also, it's all on Noah's shoulders to carry it out, and he does it faithfully.
Yeah.
The text says, and Noah did all things which God commanded him.
It's like this ultimate act of obedience.
It is. It is. And, obedience is this recurring theme, especially in these early narratives.
Right.
It's almost a foundational principle. How do you navigate God's will? Well, you obey.
And then you get that moment when they enter the ark.
Right.
And God says, go in, thou and all thy house, for thee I have seen just before me in this generation. And it's that direct link, it's his righteousness that ensures not only his survival, but the survival of his whole lineage. I mean, it really makes you think about how powerful individual integrity can be when, society is, coming apart at the seams.
Exactly. And it's fascinating. There's this distinction made about which animals go in.
Oh, yeah. About the clean and unclean.
Right. 7 pairs of clean beasts and birds, but only 2 of the unclean ones.
And that's interesting because that distinction, it actually predates the Mosaic law.
Yeah, that's a point a lot of people miss. It suggests almost this primordial understanding, right? This idea of, clean and unclean. Maybe it comes from earlier ritual practices or even just, some divine pronouncement that we don't have the full story of.
That's fascinating.
But it's there.
And then, the flood comes. 40 days and 40 nights of rain.
Yeah, which is a time frame that, across a lot of ancient cultures and traditions, 40 days and 40 nights, it really signifies a period of testing and purification. Cleansing, exactly. And it's a long time, right, but also I think it highlights the thoroughness,
Right.
The complete destruction that's happening. Every substance that I have made from the face of the earth.
That's a reset button right there.
It's a complete reset. It's like starting from scratch, a new beginning for humanity and all of creation.
And they're anchoring this event, in time. Because they say Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came on the earth.
Yeah, I mean, talk about anchoring it in time. 600 years old.
Mm-hmm.
It just underscores the weight of history, right?
Right.
The long lifespan that they attributed to, these foundational figures.
And so we're moving on, from this global destruction to a different kind of divine interaction. And we see that with Abraham's plea for Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
And it's this story that, shows us how complex, how nuanced God's justice is. But it also shows us his willingness to be merciful.
Absolutely. And right from the start, the Lord makes this huge declaration about Abraham. Right, a great and mighty nation, and that through him, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. I mean, that sets Abraham up as this pivotal figure in God's plan.
Totally.
But what's really striking is the reason that God gives.
Okay.
He says, "For I know that he will command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord and do judgment and justice." So it's not just about Abraham himself. It's about, this commitment to righteousness, to passing it on through his descendants. It's this generational promise, this generational responsibility.
And then you get to the part about Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
And it's almost investigative statement. God says the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is multiplied, and their sin is become exceedingly grievous. I will go down and see whether they have done according to the cry that has come to me, or whether it be not so, that I may know.
Right.
It sounds almost like an inquiry.
It does, yeah.
But, if God knows everything, if he's omniscient, why this phrasing? It's almost misleading.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's something that, a lot of commentators have wrestled with.
Right.
I mean, the text itself tries to address this, right?
Yeah.
It has this theological note that says going down. It's God accommodating so that we can understand. God doesn't need to, conduct an investigation like we would. He already knows.
Right.
So I think that it's more about, presenting this idea of divine judgment in a way that humans can grasp. It's emphasizing the gravity of the situation.
Right.
And, it's not just this arbitrary decision.
Right.
God is deliberating, considering, responding.
And it's interesting, the narrative, it specifies that two of the angels who appeared to Abraham, they go to Sodom, but the one who represents the Lord stays with Abraham.
Right.
And that sets the stage for that dialogue.
Absolutely.
That famous conversation.
Yeah, back and forth. Yeah, it's fascinating.
I mean, Abraham, he just straight up pleads with God, right? Wilt thou destroy the just with the wicked? And then he starts with this hypothetical, 50 righteous people. It's almost like, he's putting forth this moral math problem.
He is, and the Lord's response is immediate.
Right.
If I find in Sodom 50 just within the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake.
It's powerful.
It is. It's this principle, of divine justice tempered by mercy.
Right.
And it suggests, even a small group of righteous people, they can have this huge impact. Right. They can avert judgment.
And the amazing thing is, Abraham, he doesn't stop there.
Right.
He keeps pushing.
He keeps going.
He keeps negotiating.
Yeah.
From 50 down to 45, then 40, then 30, 20, all the way down to just 10. I mean, that takes some boldness, I think, to have that kind of back and forth.
Yeah. I mean, it shows Abraham's incredible faith.
Right.
His understanding of God's character. And, each time the Lord agrees, he agrees to spare the city.
Right.
And I think that repetition, that concession each time, it really highlights God's patience.
Yeah.
This deep desire to find even a little bit of righteousness. And the fact that God's even willing to engage in this kind of negotiation, I think it says a lot about his character.
It really does. It's like there's this openness, right, to human appeal.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, the story ends with, not even 10 righteous people could be found.
Right.
And Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed.
Yeah, it's this tragic reminder that there are limits.
Yeah.
Even to divine mercy, especially when the wickedness is just overwhelming.
And it makes you think, right? Like, where's that balance?
Exactly.
Between God's justice and the potential for humans to actually turn things around?
Yeah, it's a question that I think continues to echo throughout all of these scriptures.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we come to another story with Abraham, and this time it involves King Abimelech and Sarah.
Right.
And it takes place in Gerar.
Mm-hmm.
And this story really gets into, deception.
Yeah.
But it also shows us how God intervenes, sometimes in really unexpected ways, like through dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And it brings up this really important concept, the fear of God, how that plays out and how people interact with each other. So tell me a little bit about that story.
Well, Abraham's in Gerar, and again, he claims that Sarah is his sister.
Okay.
And, Abimelech, the king, he doesn't know the truth. So he takes Sarah into his household. But God steps in. He appears to Abimelech in a dream. And dreams are this common way in these early texts that God communicates. And he warns Abimelech, you're going to die because you took this married woman.
Wow.
Pretty serious stuff.
And then Abimelech, he says, hold on. I'm innocent here. I didn't even touch her. And he points out, look, both Abraham and Sarah, they told me they were siblings.
Right.
I mean, that's a good point, right?
It is. It's like, how much responsibility do we have for our actions when someone else is deceiving us?
Exactly.
It's a tricky situation. But, and this is important, God acknowledges Abimelech's sincerity. He says, I know that thou didst it with a sincere heart, and therefore I withheld thee from sinning against me, and I suffered thee not to touch her.
It's like, even though Abimelech was kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, God saw his heart.
Exactly. And that's crucial. God isn't just looking at the outward actions. He's looking at the inner intentions.
Right.
The motivations. And that's a recurring theme, I think, in these stories.
And then God, he gives Abimelech a very clear instruction. Restore Sarah to Abraham, because he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live.
Right.
And it's interesting because, on the one hand, you have this very human story of deception and fear. But then on the other hand, you have this elevation of Abraham's role. It's like he's got this special connection with God.
He does. He's a prophet. And his prayers, they have power. They can actually bring life. And, the story tells us Abimelech, he acts right away. He's scared, and his servants are scared too.
Right.
And then he goes and confronts Abraham. He's like, what were you thinking?
Yeah.
You almost brought this huge sin upon my kingdom.
Right.
And so he's demanding an explanation, right? Holding him accountable.
And Abraham, how does he respond to that?
Well, he's very honest.
Okay.
Maybe brutally honest. He says, I thought with myself, saying, perhaps there is not the fear of God in this place, and they will kill me for the sake of my wife.
He was scared.
He was afraid. He admitted it. And he even says that, he had this prearranged agreement with Sarah to say that she was his sister. So, yeah, he was being deceptive, but it was out of fear.
I mean, even these, these heroes of faith, they weren't perfect, right?
Right. They're still human.
Yeah.
They're still flawed. And you see that here. Even Abraham, chosen by God, he's still driven by this basic instinct of self-preservation.
Right.
And, when he feels vulnerable, he gives into that temptation to deceive.
Right.
But what's really interesting is Abimelech's response.
Yeah, I was going to say that. It's pretty generous, considering.
It is. He gives Abraham sheep, oxen, servants, handmaids.
Wow.
Says you can live anywhere you want in my land.
That's amazing.
And, he gives Sarah 1,000 pieces of silver.
Wow.
And he says it's, a covering of thy eyes.
It's almost like a public apology.
Yeah, or maybe a way to restore her honor.
Right.
Because of what happened. But then the story ends with this beautiful act of restoration. Abraham prays, and God heals Abimelech, his wife, and his handmaids.
Right.
Because their wombs had been closed.
Right.
Because of Sarah.
Right.
And so, the story comes full circle.
Yeah.
It's this reminder that even when we make mistakes, even when there's conflict, God can bring healing. He can restore order.
And it's through the faithfulness of Abraham.
Exactly. And the acknowledgement that Abimelech's heart was sincere.
Okay. So moving on, we see Isaac, Abraham's son, And he also has some challenges in Gera,
Oh,
right?
it does.
And these challenges, they revolve around something that seems pretty mundane. Water wells.
Yeah, it's like, who would have thought that water wells would be this source of such contention?
Right. But, I mean, if you think about it, in that region,
Yeah.
water's life,
Absolutely. It's essential. It's everything.
So, yeah, it's not so mundane when you really think about it.
Right. And Isaac's herdsmen, they kept running into problems with the herdsmen of Gerara. Right. It was this constant back and forth. And they even named two of the wells based on these conflicts, calumny and enmity.
I mean, those names speak for themselves.
They do. They really highlight the strife that was going on.
But then something changes, right?
It does. Isaac digs a third well, and this time there's no fighting, no arguing.
Okay.
And he calls it latitude.
Okay.
Because he says, now hath the Lord given us room and made us to increase upon the earth.
So it's like this moment of God's provision, right?
Absolutely. It's like God stepping in and transcending this human conflict.
Yeah.
And the name itself, latitude, it means spaciousness, room to grow. It's this beautiful metaphor for God's blessing expanding, going beyond these human limitations.
Right.
And then after this, the Lord appears to Isaac in Bersabee.
Okay.
And he reaffirms the covenant he made with Abraham.
Right.
He promises Isaac blessings, descendants, all for Abraham's sake.
And how does Isaac respond?
Well, he does what, people of faith did back then. He builds an altar.
Right.
He calls upon the Lord's name. He sets up his tent, makes it his home. And significantly, he digs another well.
Wow. So even after all the conflict,
Yeah.
he's still trusting God to provide.
Exactly.
And then what happens? You have this unexpected visit.
We do. Abimelech, he shows up again.
With who?
He brings his friend Ahgozaph and Phicol, his army captain. They come all the way from Gerar.
And Isaac, he remembers what happened before.
Right. He's like, why are you here? You hated me. You kicked me out.
Yeah.
But their response is amazing.
What do they say?
They say, we saw that the Lord is with thee, and therefore we said, let there be an oath between us, and let us make a covenant, that thou do us no harm, as we, on our part, have touched nothing of thine, but with peace have sent thee away, increased with the blessing of the Lord.
It's like they see that Isaac is blessed and they want to be on his good side.
Exactly. They recognize God's favor on Isaac's life, and they want peace. They want a covenant. They don't want any more trouble.
And how does Isaac respond?
Well, he throws a feast for them.
Okay.
And in the morning, they make this oath, this covenant of peace.
Right.
And then they go their separate ways. And then that very day,
wow.
Isaac's servants, they find another well with fresh water.
Incredible.
And Isaac, he calls it abundance.
Abundance. It's like after all that contention,
right,
there's this overflowing blessing.
It is. It's this beautiful picture of reconciliation.
Yeah.
And it shows, even when there's conflict, even when humans mess things up, God can bring peace.
Right.
And he can bring abundance.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the text mentions that the city kept the name Bersabee, which means, well of the oath. So it's like this reminder, this event, this covenant, it's part of the history of that place.
It's woven into the fabric of their story.
Exactly. Okay. So we're going to jump ahead now to a very significant moment, and that's Jacob blessing his sons.
Right.
And this is important because, these blessings, they essentially lay out the future of the 12 tribes of Israel.
They do. They give us a glimpse into their character, their destiny. It's fascinating. And this happens, much later in the narrative. Jacob's nearing the end of his life. He's in Egypt.
Right.
But we're reminded about his sons with Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin.
Right.
And then their sons who were born in Egypt, Manasseh and Ephraim.
Right.
And these grandsons, they become tribes later on.
Right. It's like the family's expanding, it's growing.
It is. And the text is very careful to list all of Benjamin's sons and also the sons of Bala, who was Rachel's maidservant. It's like it's giving us this full picture of Jacob's lineage.
Right.
This family that's going to become the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
And we're told that 70 of Jacob's descendants went into Egypt. So you see how much the family's grown during their time there.
And it's interesting, right? There's that moment where Jacob sends Judah ahead to Joseph. And then they have that reunion. It's very emotional.
It is. It's this beautiful moment of reconciliation, of family coming back together.
And Jacob says, now shall I die with joy, because I have seen thy face, and leave thee alive.
Yeah, powerful stuff. It shows the depth of their love, after all those years of thinking Joseph was dead.
And then Joseph, he's very smart.
Mm-hmm.
He knows how to play the game, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
He prepares his brothers, to meet Pharaoh.
Right.
And he tells them to emphasize their occupation as shepherds.
Mm-hmm.
And then he requests to live in the land of Goshen.
Right.
Because, he knew the Egyptians, they weren't too keen on shepherds.
Yeah, shepherds were kind of looked down upon, so he's being strategic,
Right.
trying to find a place for his family where they'll have some space, some autonomy.
And when they meet Pharaoh,
Mm-hmm.
the brothers, they're very honest. They say,
Yeah.
we're shepherds.
They do. And because of that,
Yeah.
they're allowed to settle in Goshen.
Right.
Which was perfect. It was this region that was, geographically and culturally distinct.
Right.
So they had their own customs, their own way of life.
And finally we get to these blessings.
Right.
And it starts with Reuben, the firstborn. But he messed up, right?
He did. He defiled his father's bed.
Right.
And the blessing says that he won't grow.
And what does that mean?
Well, it means he loses the double inheritance that the firstborn usually gets.
Right.
He loses the right to rule and the priestly lineage.
It's like a serious consequence.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. It's this disruption of the patriarchal order.
And that right to rule and the priestly duties, they go to other sons. Right.
They do. The double portion goes to Joseph.
Right.
Judah gets the leadership, and eventually Levi gets the priestly duties.
And then you have Simeon and Levi.
Mm-hmm.
And their blessing, it links them together.
It does. They're brethren, vessels of iniquity waging war.
So not exactly a positive blessing.
Not really, no. And they're cursed because of their actions against the men of Shechem.
Right.
And the way they undermined a wall. And, some people see this as a foreshadowing
Right.
of the crucifixion of Christ.
Right, because their descendants would be involved in that.
Exactly. And because of their actions, they don't get a consolidated inheritance.
Right.
They're divided, they're scattered throughout Israel.
And then you get to Judah.
Mm-hmm.
And his blessing is powerful.
It's huge.
He's praised by his brothers. He's promised victory. And he's called a lion's whelp,
Right.
which is this symbol of strength, of fertility.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this really important part of the blessing.
The prophecy.
Yeah. The scepter shall not be taken away from Judah, nor a ruler from his thigh, till he come that is to be sent, and he shall be the expectation of nations.
Right. I mean, this is a messianic prophecy. It's
Yeah.
pointing to the future king, the savior.
Right. And that lineage, it's a central part of both Jewish and Christian theology.
It is. It identifies the tribe that the Messiah would come from. And, later on, people would use this prophecy to argue against those who said Jesus wasn't the Messiah.
Right. Because, there was always some form of leadership within the tribe of Judah
Mm-hmm.
until the time of Christ.
Exactly.
And then the blessings continue. Zebulun, he's going to dwell by the seashore.
Mm-hmm.
Issachar, he's going to become a servant under tribute.
Right.
And Dan, he's going to be a judge.
Mm-hmm.
And each of these blessings
What if-
gives us this glimpse into their character, their future role within the nation of Israel.
Exactly. And all of these pronouncements, they become this foundational understanding of the tribes,
Right.
their inheritance, their destiny. And, it shapes the future of Israel politically, religiously.
Totally.
Oh.
Okay, so moving on to the Exodus narrative. We see that God is very active, in establishing order and security for his chosen people. And one of the ways he does this is by promising a very special guide,
Right.
an angel.
Yeah, an angel to go before them, to guide them, to protect them.
Right. And it's interesting because this isn't just, a friendly companion.